Great. Welcome. Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone, wherever you are. And welcome to this conversation with Dr. Maribel Morey. I'm Joe Waters, the co-founder and CEO of Capita, and we're delighted to those of you who are attending us today. This is a topic that has been of interest to ours from at least April of 2019, and that topic is the renewal of philanthropy with justice at the center. The first paper that Capita actually ever published was a white paper in 2019 entitled Tomorrow is Now, New Directions for Children's Philanthropy. So I'm delighted to return to this important topic in today's conversation with Dr. Morey. A historian of U.S. philanthropy, the social sciences, and racial equality, Maribel Morey is founding executive director of the Miami Institute for Social Sciences, a nonprofit organization centering the work of global majority scholars in the social sciences as a means both for improving the integrity and rigor of these fields and for building more inclusive national and international political economies. Her research has been supported by fellowships and grants, for example, from the Andrew Carnegie Scholars Program at the Carnegie Corporation of New York, a little bit of an irony there, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the Fulbright Program, and the American Scandinavian Foundation. Maribel's peer-reviewed work has appeared in Humanity, Law, Culture, and the Humanities, and Reviews in American History. Her public scholarship has appeared on HistPhil. Is that how you all pronounce it?
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's a blog that she co-founded and co-edits that explores the history of philanthropy, the Stanford Social Innovation Review, the Atlantic, and elsewhere. She received her PhD in history from Princeton University, a law degree from NYU, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Notre Dame. So your book tells the story of one philanthropy's investment in one sociological study, but it is a story that is much larger than that and generalizable to how much of Anglo-American philanthropy has operated to underwrite white domination, both here in the United States and around the world, particularly in Africa. Why is the Carnegie Corporation's funding of An American Dilemma a good representation of how philanthropy as a field has historically underwritten white domination globally? Maribel, can you hear us?
Joe, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Okay, so my internet connection was unstable while you started describing the book. So if you can go back to your description, that'd be really helpful.
Sure. So I just said, why is the Carnegie Corporation's funding of An American Dilemma a good representation of how philanthropy as a field has historically underwritten white domination globally?
As a good representation, as a historical
of how philanthropy as a field has underwritten white domination globally.
Oh, okay. Right. So that's a hard question for a historian. And let me see. I do subscribe to the idea that to know one foundation is to know one foundation. So I do not like to make generalities or generalizations about philanthropy or foundation specifically from the study of one organization. So to the point of, in the book, I describe the Carnegie Corporation's funding patterns in the first half of the 20th century in the cooperative social sciences, and specifically in 3 major studies that it financed. And I detail its own relationships to other foundations, such as Rockefeller Foundation, and also the Rockefellers Laura Spelman Rockefeller Memorial, General Education Board, Phelps Stokes Fund. So treating each, organizations are their own organisms. They're made up of human beings who have different personalities and also have different relationships with each other. So a board can change very much the moment that, as I explained in the book, 3 lifetime members pass away. And that changes the dynamic. So really understanding, for me, it takes so much time, really, because it's a combination of people to really understand dynamics between leadership. So not just the president of the organization, but also his, in this time, relationship to the board. And then also their advisors and how those, as I describe it, these dialogues take place, and understanding who has a more dominant opinion on certain topics or others. So that takes years in the archives. And that's just to understand one organization in one period of time on a particular topic. So I think that's really important. One, to appreciate in how we talk about even philanthropy today is one that, what is philanthropy? Perhaps these foundations should not be equated with philanthropy. Philanthropy is a love of mankind, or, a love for others. And there are a lot of people who do that in their day-to-day lives with a lot less money, possibly with no money, with their time, with their intentions. So disentangling philanthropy from foundations. And then when we're talking about foundations, understanding how they are different combinations of people over time and space. And that requires a lot of analysis.
Very interesting. So let's talk first about leadership, if we could. Tell us about the figures of Andrew Carnegie and Frederick Keppel in particular, who figure prominently in the narrative of your book, and certainly figure prominently in the history, at least, of foundations, if not philanthropy, in the early part of the 20th century in the United States. Why are they important?
Right. So Frederick Keppel was president of Carnegie Corporation of New York from the 1920s to the early 1940s. And he oversees the funding of An American Dilemma. Before that, he also oversaw the funding of the Poor White Study in South Africa, published in 1932, and an African survey through Chatham House in London, which was published in 1938. So he's a central figure. So when I talk about, I just wrote a piece for Hisville on the methodology behind this project. And once I did a quick, not quick in historian's word, which is probably like a year and a half, 2 or something like that, of understanding the documents of the Carnegie Corporation related to its direct funding of An American Dilemma, I backtracked and said, let me go with a bird's eye view of the organization from its founding in 1911 up until the 1940s to understand its framework. Because as much as Frederick Keppel was the president overseeing the funding of An American Dilemma, he came into an organization with its own culture, with its own expectations. So trying to understand what that space was like. So that's looking through first the annual reports and the board minutes. And then after that, really understanding the networks of people, including Keppel and his advisors, understanding the space around him. And part of that space was Andrew Carnegie. So in today's parlance, we talk about the dead hand, donor's intent in foundation world. And Carnegie did play a central role as in understanding donors' intent in the 1910s and 20s, much as other founders still do in their foundations long past their death. And for Keppel, he was trying to understand what was this organization that he was inheriting. So at the time, the organization's geographic scope was limited to the US, Canada, and the British colonies. While taking over this organization, a central question was, well, how do we define the US? Does it include the Philippines? What are the British colonies? And you could go to the lawyers. They're a team of lawyers who would go through different documents and legal documents and make sense of these geographic spaces and give advice. Another figure who played a prominent role, at least in understanding what the British colonies meant, was James Bertram. He was a personal secretary of Andrew Carnegie, who became a lifetime trustee of Carnegie Corporation. So before Andrew Carnegie established Carnegie Corporation, he did a lot of philanthropy too, aside from the organizations he established before that. Though again, in scope, Carnegie Corporation was the largest in wealth. Bertram played a central role in fielding a lot of the requests that were coming to Andrew Carnegie for philanthropic giving. So, but specifically with the definition of British colony, he had a high opinion about what Andrew Carnegie had intended with that term. And he specifically advised repeatedly over and over again that Andrew Carnegie had intended communities of white people. So we were, not to follow what, the British government might be saying is a colony or a commonwealth or a dominion, but really to analyze where white communities could be dominant in different parts of the British Empire. So he said, this would mean that we cannot and will not fund in West Africa. We will fund in East Africa. We will fund in South Africa, even though it's a dominion, also New Zealand, and never India. So these are the dynamics that are at play. Can you hear? Yeah, that are at play between, in the book, understanding the role of Andrew Carnegie in shaping the geographic scope and substantive mission of the organization that Keppel inherited, and then to what extent within that framework Keppel introduced his own preferences. So he starts introducing his own preferences for funding the social sciences. He had been dean of Columbia College. He had worked in the War Department during the First World War and started seeing the value of data collection. So inheriting an organization that was really about privileging the needs of white people in the Anglo-American world, he started seeing a role for himself in spearheading these projects of funding cooperative social science studies targeted towards white policymakers.
So, Maribel, before we go on to talk about an American dilemma in particular, I'm curious: were these the attitudes of Andrew Carnegie's colleagues, the others who established large, significant foundations like this? How typical was it among these early foundations in the 20th century to be, so explicit in funding communities of white people?
Yeah, no, I don't think he was so uncommon, and perhaps more than other founders, definitely more than John D. Rockefeller. Carnegie liked to write down his ideas about philanthropy, gospel of wealth, triumph of democracy. So he had big ideas about international order, about the role of wealth redistribution and an alternative to socialism, it being philanthropy. So perhaps more than others in his peer group, he liked to tease it out in prose. So there's more paper trail, in many ways, formal paper trail. But as I explained in the book, this was the idea of an Anglo-American union was not so unique, right? It's at the heart of the founding of Chatham House in London and the Council of Foreign Relations in New York. It's in the heart of even today how many people assume that that international order requires white Anglo-American unity between London and DC. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And I think one thing that's striking about the book is not only the influence of a particular foundation here, the Carnegie Corporation, in financing a particular body of sociological research that has enormous influence, not only on, as you described, sort of this notion of white domination, but it has enormous influence in public policy, generally speaking. And you mentioned Chatham House, you mentioned the Council of Foreign Relations. In addition to how explicit, as you just described, he was around this notion of white communities of whiteness, white communities of white people. How explicit was he in thinking of how the foundation might influence public policy and politics?
Who's the he here now? Carnegie or
Carnegie or Kepler? Yeah, both.
Okay. Yeah, that's at the heart of the game of foundations, right? So there's a tension of not wanting to seem interested in shaping legislation, but wanting to be impactful. And a very clear way of showing impact is through the influence of public policy, and hopefully a little bit amorphous so that you don't seem like you're trying to be political, but sharp enough and clear enough that you can show your board. In many ways, it's interesting because I've talked to contemporary, obviously, like being in dialogue with people in my own lifetime who are in philanthropy. thinking that this vision of strategic philanthropy, you're trying to prove impact of grant making decisions, is something very modern, very new. But we see it from the start of these organizations in the early 20th century. It might not be, in graphs, or it might not be in these, clear documents, but they do want to see that their money goes towards some sort of change or to solve some sort of problem. So I would say Keppel was very clear that he wanted these studies to be to have some policy effect. And how would I say that? That's my conclusion. So the data behind that would be in the selection of advisors. So one of his main inspirations for going to British Africa was his interactions with an individual called J.H. Oldham, who becomes his main advisor on the continent. He's based in London. And he says in 1925 that he wants more funding for research on the continent. And he's speaking on behalf of the British Colonial Office, who wants some of the US dollars. And they have to convince these people sitting in New York City that it's worth their time and money to channel money across the Atlantic. And he says, look, there's a rising racial consciousness amongst Africans right now. And that's going to affect you guys too. Like any growth in a transatlantic racial consciousness amongst Black people could really threaten international order. And so from the start, a lot of these projects are seen as a way to address a societal problem that they perceive being really imminent. And so the advisors are people who are thinking through on how to apply this research to a problem they see. And in South Africa, the problem they see is a poverty amongst white people, specifically Afrikaners, because they see that these advisors as a destabilizing white domination in the region. And that for them is key to international peace. That's a jump, right? It's like saying, if there's instability in white domination, there will be instability in peace. Why? Because it's assumed in many ways that white people will react with violence. And then in the African survey, the same way, from Chatham House, the recommendation for an African survey, the problem being that the fear of losing control on the continent and learning from each other's imperial experiences across the continent could help solidify and continue white presence on the continent. Yeah, so always the advisors are very much seeking that Carnegie Corporation has in these networks, are trying to solve a public problem, a perceived one.
Great. So let's talk about an American dilemma in particular. This was the sociological survey by Gunnar Myrdal that was financed by the Carnegie Corporation, and it really is at the heart of your book and at the heart of your claims about how the work that was happening then and there was underwriting white domination. So tell us about the book. Tell us about Myrdal. How did it get started that Carnegie Corporation funded this? And then we'll start to talk about the implications.
Okay. So an American dilemma, usually the way it's historically been told is that there was a board member, Newton Baker, who suggested the project. And that's how many scholars have told the story. And actually Keppel himself, in the preface to the book, amplifies Baker's role. I've had the good fortune of being able to spend countless amounts of wasteless time in the archives and going through documents so years and years of going through uncatalogued boxes, etc. And another thing that scholars in that same spirit would undermine Keppel's vision as a leader. He's been characterized as someone who sort of just like went with the flow and just funded things as they came. But as I described him, he did have a vision. He was in dialogue with his grantees and his advisors, but there was a vision. And some of the people closest to him during the funding of An American Dilemma would say, including Donald Young and others, who was a sociologist, that Keppel was known for attributing ideas to other people, and that this project was his baby. The direct quotes of it in the book in White Philanthropy. So it was something that this is part of his leadership style. By the time that he was funding An American Dilemma, this trustee, this board member, had passed away. So he could use him as he wished. And it became a useful tool for him too. One, because it was a risky project in the US for the reason that nobody actually commissioned it. No advisor asked for this project. So in South Africa, the Poor White Study was requested by advisors. And in Chatham House, an African survey was requested by advisors, though he was in dialogue and shaped and helped shape the concept of it. This one, nobody. I mean, so in the spirit, he was the one who, like, they rented an office for Myrdal, walking distance from the corporation. He oversaw the day-to-day handling of it directly from the office of the president. So there's a lot at stake. So it was very helpful for him. It was like a risky project at the end of his presidency. It was helpful for him to have a deceased trustee who had been Secretary of War, highly respected across the US, to whom he could really attribute some of the heat. Also became helpful when he was writing the preface that Baker was Southern. And one of his anxieties, the one tension that he had with Myrdal in this project, was that while they both agreed that white Americans should remain the main audience for the book, Myrdal came to the conclusion that he didn't really have to appeal to white Southerners because they were, one, and from his perspective, less affluent, less powerful, and divided. So he could write a whole book shaping a national policy program on Black Americans that appealed to the more powerful white Americans, i.e. white Northerners and New Dealers. That got Keppel nervous because he assumed, like in the South African study, that you had to bring in Afrikaners and British settlers together, much like you would here have to bring white people across regions together for something to work, for a policy program to work. And so he really highlights in the preface, in the forward, that Baker was a Southern man. And if you're a white Southern reader, one of your own really wanted this project to come about. So you should really read this in the best of intentions. And if you see anything in this book that's critical of the white South, just so you know, this is not Myrdal's first language. So forgive him. Can you see me now?
Yeah.
Sometimes the connection fails, but so the book itself, Myrdal, and as many people would remember the project, he says there is the American dilemma is a moral dilemma in the hearts and minds of white Americans. It's a dilemma between their anti-Black discriminatory practices and their American ideals. Joe, can you hear me? Because sometimes it says that my connection is unstable.
No,
so I'm
we
not
can
sure.
hear you fine. Yeah.
Okay, great. And so the American dilemma is this moral dilemma in the hearts and minds of white Americans between their discriminatory practices and American ideals. And the way to solve this is to correct this discriminatory practices and meet these ideals. And he offers what he calls a white man's rank order discriminations tailored to the sensibilities of white Americans on just tackle first the things that they're not as tied to in forms of white supremacy that he deems. And then dealing with the ones that they are most tied to, such as intermarriage, especially anything that has to do with white women. So he gives a whole order, and he says, if you follow this, you will meet up to your ideals. And as he explains, this is really critically important during the Second World War because the US needs to present itself as a particularly moral country on the world stage. When you start penetrating this project, though, as I explained in the quotations in the book, his vision of assimilation is about assimilating Blackness and making it disappear into whiteness, and to make the US, in the spirit, one of the strongest white nations in the world. And one of the quotes here is, Americans also recognize that America has to take world leadership. The coming difficult decades will be America's turn in the endless sequence of main actors on the world stage. America then will have the major responsibility for the manner in which humanity approaches the long era during which the white peoples will have to adjust to shrinkage, while the colored are bound to expand in numbers, in level of industrial civilization and in political power. For perhaps several decades, the whites will still hold the lead, and America will be the most powerful white nation.
So what is the enduring influence of this text in American policy, in American philanthropy, from after the 1940s straight through to the present?
Yeah, so those are famously, an American dilemma was cited by the US Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. More deeply, it's penetrated just how many Americans talk about racial equality. So there's a big equation in the US between equality, racial equality, and racial assimilation, the erasure of non-white groups into a white nation, a white Anglo-American nation. So those two assumptions are there. It's also, though, so that's a critical read of it, but on a more, forgiving read, it's also a text that allows BIPOC groups to speak about the moral obligations of a dominant white Anglo-American group to treat BIPOC groups better. So it serves as a useful tool for a dialectic on what it means to be moral, even if the definition itself is lacking.
Great. And what, one thing as I was reading the book is I was thinking, what is today's version of an American dilemma in philanthropy? Has there been something similarly published, say, in the last decade or two, underwritten by large philanthropic organizations that is having a similar effect in terms of intentionally or unintentionally, perhaps, continuing to perpetuate white domination and white supremacy? So I'm just curious, have you given that
actually
question
really
any
deep,
thought?
The way that this dynamic happened. So something that you see in the book is just the subtle ways that networks of advisors come to be. So one question would be, why do we consider, like I'm putting myself in the position as like a program officer or someone on the board, like why do I think that certain people are authoritative in this topic? What audience am I seeking to impact? Because if we're still trying to impact policymakers, arguably in the global north, we're still in the echoes of an American dilemma or this earlier 20th century history, maintaining a white audience, right? That's one. So like, who are your advisors? How are they shaping authority? Why do you think they're authoritative? And then two, how are they defining the problems to be solved? Are they in fact problems? Was rising racial consciousness really a problem? I would say no. But so how are problems being defined? And relatedly, why are we experiencing fear? Because these earlier actors feared this rising racial consciousness and they expressed it as a threat to international order. But did it have to be a threat to international order if one was willing to all come together in shared dignity and respect? So I think I tell a very specific history because as a historian, I'm going to have to root myself in a lot of footnotes and documents. At the same time, we can also see ourselves in this story. This is not just a story about Carnegie Corporation, an American Dilemma, the Poor White Study, and African Survey. It's a history about and a present about philanthropy, why they fund certain projects, the role that they expect these projects to play, and the ripple effects in our lives and how we think about equality, and more specifically for scholars, who gets funded and who doesn't, depending on their demographic makeup, but also how they imagine the role of the social sciences to play in society. Are we establishing knowledge so that dominant groups can dominate better? Or is there a deeper public purpose to knowledge creation in the social sciences that's more public oriented?
So one question that we received from those who registered for this event is around transparency and what is perceived, I believe, probably correctly, as the enduring lack of transparency in large philanthropy in particular, but maybe even more so in small philanthropy. Family foundations who funded a particular community, and they get together the day after Thanksgiving and they make the decisions about what they're going to fund in their small town or wherever the case may be. And so how are foundations, I mean, based on your historical investigation maybe and the investigations of others, how are foundations reckoning with this, right? About the question that you have identified: who are the advisors? Who defines the problem? And how do we make those the answers to those questions, the wrestling with those questions, in fact, more transparent and responsive to the people who maybe are experiencing the problem that perhaps isn't actually a problem to them?
Yeah, no, thanks for that question, Joe. I sense that you experienced this in your own life.
No comment.
Came from a deeper place. Okay, so yeah, so transparency can go from the level of, okay, so should Mackenzie Scott feel an obligation to say why she's selecting certain groups over others? Or is a 2-paragraph Medium post sufficient? I would argue that when you can shape civil society and whole social movements in the US to a certain degree, you're threatening vibrant democratic life. There's a higher obligation to be more transparent on why you're choosing certain groups and how these groups fit into your vision for the future of society and how you hope for it to change. Because transparency, to many of us who care about democratic life, or at least it's essential to empower members of our society to understand how public goods and public spaces are being shaped, spaces and goods that they should have a voice in shaping. Okay, now that aside, there's also questions about how organizations themselves, so aside from individual philanthropists and how much impact, gauging on the impact they're having, how much transparency they owe the public. And as far as organizations that have some obligation for transparency as a 501c3 or something, yeah, I still think they should amplify and go beyond that 501c3 obligation for similar reasons. And one thing at the heart of it, I think that we have to remember, is that it cannot just simply be platitudes to say that the purpose of your organization is to serve the public. Honestly, like if you are an organization that's serving the public, whether you're a university or a foundation or a nonprofit, you have an obligation to remain in dialogue with the public. Otherwise, you're just being paternalistic and assuming that you know what they want and you don't need to talk to them. You never need to tell them anything. So a foundation should be in dialogue and explaining to the publics they're serving around the world. So not just the US public, but any public they're penetrating, how and why they're making their decisions, who's influencing their decisions, what they expect from that funding conclusion, and how they see their impacts playing out. That's informing the very public. That's actually respecting the public that you say you're serving. And a similar way, if I had to go into knowledge production in the academy, we really, and as many other people have been saying for a long time, question the privatization of knowledge production. So, having a lot more that's open access. What's the role of knowledge production, if not for the public? Mm-hmm.
So, Maribel, I want to go back to what you said about Mackenzie Scott, right? Because she has made tremendous investments in, for example, HBCUs, right? Which I think are very well intentioned in terms of promoting justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But as you pointed out, not transparent at all. So how do we hold, sort of reconcile that tension, right? That I can be maybe very happy about the organizations that are benefiting from her philanthropy, while also having some real concerns about how it's being done. So, and I think a lot of people, maybe they don't want to raise the concern about transparency or dialogue with the public because, frankly, they support they support the end if they don't necessarily support the means.
Right. So that's something when I was in law school, you kind of have to confront pretty early on, right? So you can't just be a fan of the Supreme Court when it's in your favor and say, you should have a heavy Supreme Court and a disabled Congress, for example, or legislative branch. I think at some level, our integrity as thinkers requires us to think beyond, just that the ends justify the means, and think about what kind of democratic society is most democratic, whether or not that particular segment of it is on our team. So whether or not a very affluent giver is on our team, we have to think, what role are they playing in a democracy ultimately? Because they can be benevolent today, but as we know with the Supreme Court, that can change and they're no longer on your side. So ultimately, what is democracy and what institutions further that? So I think to reconcile, sometimes we can't reconcile, and it's okay to own two or multiple truths. So even going back to An American Dilemma, I can understand and appreciate An American Dilemma, the text, as a tool, and also understand its roots in white supremacy. Right? Those two things can coexist as a tool for dialogue and equality while it's still rooted in white supremacy. And in a similar way, one can acknowledge and honor the fact that certain groups that you might like seeing getting funding are getting funding, while also saying, I'm not sure about the lack of transparency, not only as a democratic obligation, but also the anxiety that it brings to the nonprofit world, civil society. It's not the most empowered civil society if it's at the beck and call of the whims of one person, and willing to put aside its principles of the role that everyday people should be playing in civil society in order to get the next big check.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really helpful. Maribel, I want to give you an opportunity to just maybe reflect on the experience of writing this book, in part because as I read in the acknowledgments, you did so as a Carnegie fellow, I believe, right? You had some funding from Carnegie. And so you note, right, in the acknowledgments, that irony or perhaps that tension was not lost on you in the writing of the book. So could you just reflect on, your own experience of benefiting from philanthropic investment to do this sort of investigatory work?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Yeah, so I got this big award. In fact, I was 9 months pregnant with my daughter when I was selected by the university to be the junior member to apply for this grant. And it escaped my mind. And there I am with like a 5-month-old baby, and I get this grant. 2 years of sabbatical for my teaching to write. And I get this grant from Carnegie Corporation, which feels nice, right? Like it's prestigious, it's cool, right? But then I had this grant as a Latina, a non-Black Latina, to write 2 studies, because there's a second book on the making, on the lived experience of Black Americans and philanthropy. And I couldn't separate it from my mind that I was writing a book on a white Swede, an American, a whole network of white Anglo-Americans and proximate other ethnic groups in shaping knowledge on Black people across the Atlantic. So what role was I playing in the academy? So I get this award. I use it to get a higher position or something. Then who am I ethically? Not in the story I'm living and researching. So I think it definitely really got me thinking about the role I wanted to play in the academy. So and to what extent I wanted to do something about it, about the inequities of knowledge production. And one of the reviewers really leads me into that. In the process of writing, that clarified my writing of this book. I let go of the expectation of getting into a more prestigious white Anglo-American space in the academy. That made it harder to publish this book, okay, for obvious reasons. And so letting go of that. And then also in turn, it starts the beginning of the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences, which we founded as a space to bring together global majority scholars across the global South and North to learn from each other, something that we don't generally do because we're so focused on responding to the problem shaped by leading white Anglo-Americans in the academy, of trying to please these dominant groups that shape gatekeeping from peer review to tenure. So creating a space for meeting each other and for talking about how we think about knowledge production in the academy, inequities. And ultimately, I see that as really key for international peace, if we had to say something like an honest forum, where it's inclusive dialogues by academics thinking about how to think about each other, which is at the groundwork of community building. So yeah, there's a lot of internal analysis in the process and transformation in the process of writing this book.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I do want to just take a few more minutes here and invite you maybe to read a passage of the book of your selection, so that we can hear the tone of it. And a reminder to our visitors today who are joining us either on YouTube or on Zoom, that the book is just been published in the last month. It's called White Philanthropy, and it's published by the University of North Carolina Press. And so we would encourage you to buy it from a BIPOC-owned bookstore, or maybe even a cooperatively and democratically owned bookstore as well. We have a few of those, I know, here in North Carolina and around the country. So Maribel, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Joe. In presenting this colonial African history to an American dilemma, White's Philanthropy furthermore introduces to scholars of African studies, transnational studies, global history, world systems, imperial history, etc., who long have analyzed the making of a white Anglo-American world order and Black resistance to the making of global white supremacy, how an American dilemma was linked to the poor white problem in South Africa and an African survey as part of Carnegie Corporation's plan in the first half of the 20th century to further solidify white Anglo-American rule and Black subjection across the Atlantic. And yet, as much as I intend to contribute to scholarly conversations on an American dilemma, I have not written this book simply for this purpose. I also have written it to disrupt contemporary public conversations about racial equality and white supremacy in the US today. Because we Americans need to acknowledge that our national conversations about racial equality, still so shaped by an American dilemma, continue to be intrinsically connected to a project among white funders, policymakers, and their advisors in the social sciences and education during the early 20th century to create a world order led by white Anglo-Americans. I thus propose that when we Americans talk about ways to create a future free of racial domination within and beyond the United States, we should realize which intellectual sources on racial equality, such as an American dilemma, are tying us down to continued white domination and non-white subjugation. For a more egalitarian future in the intrinsically connected national and international levels, let us find inspiration, not in such texts such as an American dilemma, which are only thinly disguised efforts to continue white Anglo-American rule, but rather in those individuals described in the following pages who resisted the making of this white world order.
Thank you. And thank you for your time and for joining us today and for helping us to think not only about this particular episode and the history of philanthropy, which you describe in the book, but also in the conversation today, thinking about things like who defines what a problem is that funders are trying to solve, who are the network of advisors that shape the problem and the potential solutions to that problem, and how can those of us, all of us in civil society, but funders especially, be more in dialogue with the publics that they seek to serve. So lots to think about, Maribel. Thank you so much for your time today and for writing the book and for sharing it with us. And thanks to you all for joining this conversation with Maribel Morey. We look forward to staying in touch with you in the weeks and months ahead. And please make sure that you purchase the book. Have a great afternoon, everyone.